Over the decades, many have all but accepted an untrue premise that sexual assault cases that hinge on consent are too difficult to prove in court. What is actually true is that we don't know how to sort through the he said, she said evidence that we have. Non-stranger sexual assault cases have historically relied on the credibility of the victim versus the offender. Unfortunately, practitioners can misjudge a person's credibility because of their personal biases, beliefs around injuries, or a lack of knowledge about the impact of trauma or DNA evidence. Research has challenged myths and misconceptions about non-stranger sexual assault cases. For example, one misconception is that non-stranger sexual assault is more about sexual miscommunication than predatory sexual behavior. However, research shows that perpetrators will selectively ignore or reinterpret cues from the victim while using miscommunication as an excuse for sexual assault. Another example is that victims in this type of circumstance are not victims of violence because they haven't suffered a severe injury. Yet sexual assault without severe injury is the norm, as perpetrators often employ coercion, threats, and exploitation of vulnerabilities, like intoxication, to commit the crime. Practitioners who use evidence-based knowledge and skills can identify and sort through the he said, she said evidence that they have, leading to better investigation and prosecution of non-stranger sexual assault cases when consent is the central issue. This video challenges us to look further for lack of consent in sexual assault cases, and to investigate consent cases with the same vigor that we would a stranger sexual assault. Despite persistent challenges, law enforcement, prosecutors, and advocates have made headway. The field has advanced victims' healing from this type of assault by promoting behavioral interview techniques, remaining steadfast in their commitment to investigate these cases thoroughly, and supporting survivors.
Very common in society and even amongst law enforcement is this notion that a real rape is the one where a stranger comes up and drags you off and sexually assaults you there in the bushes. And that a situation where you were on a date and you said no and they forced themselves on you, that's not a sexual assault.
Proving that she did not consent involves both police officers, investigators, and prosecutors sort of broadening their definition of what not consenting looks like. It may not be screaming no. In fact, it probably won't be screaming no.
In actuality, consent is an informed, voluntary, and mutual agreement for sexual activity. It must be gained from each partner and for each sexual act. Silence is not consent. Non-resistance is not consent. If there is force, coercion, intimidation, threats, or duress, there is not consent.
So in these cases, it's very important to do a very thorough interview with both parties, the suspect and the victim, asking the suspect, how did you gain consent? What was said, what acts were done that made you believe you received consent for those sexual acts? Because you wanted the victim to feel blamed. You don't want to ask them, why didn't you say no? Because then that immediately puts that thought in their mind that they might have done something wrong and could be to blame for what happened.
When interviewing an alleged perpetrator, obtain an in-depth statement from the suspect in a non-threatening manner to gain as much information as possible. Ask the suspect how consent was specifically asked for and given. Suspects may inadvertently provide evidence regarding the alleged sexual assault when trying to justify their actions. When interviewing a victim, detail and corroborate what no looked like or felt like for the victim. Were they closing their eyes, looking away, or frozen in place? Document the victim's level of awareness and consciousness, plus any alcohol or drug use. Reassure the victim that you will take the case seriously and make sure to follow through.
Question your victim and ask them about what were they thinking, what were they feeling, what was going on. You know, signs that she's not consenting is the fact that she's just laying there, not engaged in the sexual act at all. The fact that she's crying while it's happening. Or perhaps she's continually trying to close her legs or pull her clothes back on that have been removed or push his hands away. All of these things would be evidence that a prosecutor could go forward of non-consent if they're properly documented and the victim's asked about them.
Ask them where their hands were, where their legs were, so you can figure out if they were trying to push that individual away, or if they were saying no, if they were crying when it happened, if they're even able to speak during that sexual assault.
Language and labels describing sexual assault matter. They can positively or negatively influence perceptions of the assault and ultimately the course of an investigation or prosecution. A description of "he forced himself onto her" demonstrates a non-consensual experience, whereas "they had intercourse" describes a consensual experience. "He said, she said" can be replaced with a much more neutral and accurate description: contradictory assertions. Such language choices influence victims, professionals, judges, and juries. Be mindful of the language you use to describe an assault. Choose words that accurately reflect the unwanted experience the victim had. Advocates can be a bridge between victims and the criminal justice system by providing information to the victim about what type of questions law enforcement and prosecutors will be asking and why. Questions such as, "When did you call the police? Did you ever say the word no?" Or, "Tell me about answering his call the next day," may be important for investigators and prosecutors to ask, but may feel blaming to victims.
Make it a point to explain to victims why is it necessary for investigators to cover certain points and why it's necessary for investigators to ask these questions around consent. That does not mean that they are not being believed. It means that they have to cover all bases to conduct the best investigation possible.
Every case that isn't a stranger case should be investigated assuming that the defense will be consent. We have to either prove, one, that she did not consent, or two, she was incapable of consenting, or three, that she submitted only due to fear, force, or coercion.
It's very important to be reassuring to the victim when you're speaking with them. Thank them for taking the time to come in. Let them know that you understand what they're doing is very hard and they're being very brave. Tell them that you're sorry that this happened. You didn't deserve for this to happen to you. You're not at fault. And just be very, very supportive of them.
Above all, communicate your belief in the victim. Remind them that no matter what they did not deserve to be sexually assaulted.
One of the hardest things victims have to deal with when they learn that the perpetrator is alleging consent is the fear that he's going to be believed over them.
And now he's denying it. In some ways that can be, it's certainly equally traumatizing because there's this drumbeat of murmurs from people that if you had really not wanted it, you would have bruising. If you had really not wanted it, it would be more clear. And that's just not the case. When you're working with those clients, you may be, in fact, the only person who believes them. Giving them choices and information, and then letting them act so that they are back in control of the process as they work through the systems.
Research on procedural justice has found that when a victim feels like they have been treated fairly and honestly by the criminal justice system, they can move on from the incident, despite the outcome of the investigation or prosecution.
I would make it a priority within the context of the consent conversation to clarify to victims that the fact that a case does not move through the court system does not mean to us or by any means that there was consent given.
Follow through on the things that you say you're going to do so that she feels like not only does she have somebody who believes her in her corner, you didn't just sit there that day that she was talking and say, "I believe you," but you stuck around and you followed through with her, that you're walking the journey with her until she walks away from it.
Use those laws to your advantage. The fact that we don't require corroboration is huge. Get out there, push the bounds, try the cases.
Consent cases pose challenges, but research and evidence-based practices provide a path forward. By focusing on the specific behaviors of both the victim and alleged perpetrator, consent or lack of consent can come into focus. Professionals must be aware of their own biases and challenge themselves to find every scrap of evidence out there. This type of follow-through will benefit survivors no matter the end result. To learn more, collaborate, and support our research, visit our website at sites.utexas.edu/IDVSA.